Hello all. Today we're going to look at the nursery rhyme The Grand Old Duke of York, the elderly aristocrat who apparently took it upon himself to lead 10,000 soldiers up a hill, and then led them down again. And then, seemingly having no understanding of military strategies or manoeuvres, the soldiers ended up neither up nor down. But how much truth is there in the rhyme? Was there really a Grand Old Duke of York obsessed with traversing the countryside? In this video we're going to explore the candidates for the real Grand Old Duke of York, and if you stay to the end you'll find out which one ended up with himself on top of a column in the centre of London. To start with, what do we mean by a duke? Well, there are many dukes. Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, was the husband to the late Queen. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, and there are some others. The Dukedom of York is unsurprisingly linked to the city of York in the north of England. Founded by the Vikings, it has a medieval cathedral, York Minster, and it's really worth a visit. York is the ancient county town of Yorkshire, the largest county in England, but you're unlikely to meet a duke there. Few of the holders of the title had any connection with either York or Yorkshire. Sadly, being the Duke of York doesn't give the holder any special rights or privileges. There's no castle or palace that goes with it, but before we start feeling sorry for them, all of the holders of the title have been members of the royal family, and almost all have been sons of the monarch, which for most of history has been a pretty easy job. There have been 14 Dukes of York. Let's look at them in turn. The title was first used in 1381 for Edmund, the fourth son of Edward III. The next was Edmund's son, Edward, who was killed at Agincourt. He died without an heir, and so his nephew, Richard, inherited the title. We'll learn more about Richard later in this video. Next comes Richard's son, another Edward, who was later to become Edward IV. Edward gave the title to his second son. This was to become a pattern, Richard, the brother of Edward V, who were both murdered in the Tower of London, reputedly by their uncle, King Richard III. We then have a bit of a break, when we have two dukes who became kings, Henry VIII of the Six Wives, and 100 years later under the Stuarts, Charles I. Charles made his second son James Duke of York in 1633, and while there was a bit of an issue that Charles had his head chopped off and the monarchy was abolished, following the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Charles II restored James as Duke of York and added the title the Duke of Albany into the bargain. The Stuarts descended from Scottish royalty, and Albany has been a dukedom in Scotland between the 14th and 16th century when Scotland was a separate kingdom, Albany being the geographical term for the part of Scotland north of the rivers Forth and Clyde. We then have a bit of a gap until George I came to the throne in 1714. George originally came from Hanover in Germany, but with the union of England and Scotland, which formed Great Britain in 1701, it seemed like a good idea to follow the pattern of the Stuarts and combine the Scottish Albany and English York to show the Georgians loved Scotland and England just as much as they loved Hanover. There were three Georgian dukes, Ernest Augustus, Edward Augustus, and finally Frederick Augustus. It's the third of these that we'll look at later. There's then a gap of over 60 years until 1892 when George again, who became the future George V, became Duke of York. The title of Albany now had been split. That had been given to one of Queen Victoria's many sons. George's second son took the title before becoming George VI. And finally we have Andrew, the son of Queen Elizabeth II, and the less said about him, the better. So which one of these many dukes was the Grand Old Duke? Let's investigate. The words as we know them today were first written down in a book of nursery rhymes by Arthur Rackham, in his Mother Goose books of 1913. So on that basis we can discount all the dukes after that date. If we look a little closer at the words, we can see that he's a Grand Duke. Well, all our dukes are grand. After all, they're dukes. And in some of the versions of the rhyme, he's a good old duke. But we do know that, as well as being grand, our duke is old, or at least moderately old. Age was a bit of a movable feast during the medieval period, but we can still discount some of our younger dukes. That still leaves us quite a few candidates, but some of these were much more famous for being a king, so it seems right that we could say goodbye to the future Henry VIII and Charles I, as well as Edward IV. We also have to assume that the Duke was some sort of soldier, or at least had some men under his command, so we can lose a few more non-soldiering dukes, or ones who are actually quite good at soldiering and not just sending soldiers up and down hills for no reason. And so we're left with 3 candidates who could be our grand old Duke. Richard, Duke of York; James, Duke of York and Albany, who did become James VII of Scotland and 2nd of England, but there's some history here which we'll come to later; and finally, Frederick Augustus, Duke of York and Albany. So let's look at each of these in turn. Richard, Duke of York, marched up and down hills during the Wars of the Roses, a series of battles for the throne of England which took place between 1455 and 1485. They were fought between the houses of York and Lancaster. During the Battle of Wakefield in December 1460, Richard, Duke of York, marched his army to his stronghold of Sandal Castle, which is on a hill, so it meets that requirement. He was 49 at the time, which is not old, but also not young for the medieval period, so we're happy with that. Richard decided to lead his army of anywhere between 500 and 8,000 men down the hill, headlong into Lancastrian forces waiting at the bottom. His reasons for doing this are lost in the mists of time. So we have a duke, we have a hill, we have some troops, maybe 10,000 strong, and they certainly ran down the hill, but it feels more like a catastrophic military manoeuvre, resulting in one dead duke. He certainly didn't march them back up again, because he was dead. Today, this Duke of York is barely remembered. He does have this rather pretty monument, but he's mostly remembered by the mnemonic that British people used to remember the colours of the rainbow. Richard of York gave battle in vain. The second leading candidate was James, Duke of York and Albany. Just to remind us, James was Duke of York from 1633 and then Duke of Albany from 1660 until he succeeded his brother and when he became James II of England and James VII of Scotland in 1685. In 1688, so when he was King rather than Duke of York, he was being challenged for the crown by his son-in-law, William of Orange. This was a period known as the Wars of Religion. When James converted to Catholicism and started becoming increasingly authoritarian, many of the English nobility deserted him in favour of the Protestant William. William sailed from his native Holland to try and seize the English crown, and by the end of November in 1688, a pitched battle between the two forces seemed inevitable. James marched his army, estimated at over 10,000, to Salisbury Plain in the southwest of England. However, many of his troops were less than loyal, and so he chose to retreat rather than fight, many of his supporters deserting him and switching to William's side. James subsequently fled to France. So we have a duke, who was actually a king, with an army of more than 10,000 men, who marched his soldiers, well, not really to a hill, but to a plain, which is kind of the opposite of a hill. But still, he's a strong contender. One thing we can say is that by 1688, when James was running away from William, a version of the nursery rhyme already existed. A poem dated from 1642 mentioned the King of France, Henry IV. He apparently had marched 40,000 men up and down hills, and this poem was popular in England as it ridiculed the French king, and the English always like to do that, so maybe people had taken this song of the French king and changed a few words in order to mock James II. James as Duke does have a legacy. Both New York City and Albany, the capital of New York State, are named in his honour. The last, and perhaps most likely candidate for the grand old Duke, is Prince Frederick Augustus, Duke of York and Albany. Prince Fred was the second son of George III and became a Duke in 1784, and there's lots of reasons to think that he actually was the grand old Duke of York. For a start, he actually did command an army in the field. He was the leader of the British forces during the French Revolutionary Wars at the end of the 18th century. The most likely events which led to the rhyme refer to when he took British forces on a campaign of Flanders. Admittedly, at this point, he was only in his early 30s, so not exactly old, but he did live to be 63, so it could have been sung years afterwards. In the summer of 1794, young Fred took his army off to Flanders, what is now Belgium, to fight the French. but it didn't go very well. York himself was nearly taken prisoner, and despite the arrival in July of 10,000 fresh troops, note that number, the Duke was driven out of Belgium and back to England. So we have a Duke of 10,000 men who went to war and came back again. It's been hypothesized that the hill in question could have been one outside of Cassel, where the Duke stationed his army for a time, but there's no evidence he actually went near this hill, let alone taking his men up and down it. In 1799, he tried again, this time invading Holland. Sadly, this too was a disaster, and again he had to bring his soldiers back. The second failure confirmed the opinion of many in the British government that the Duke was unfit to command an army in the field. Fred wasn't the brightest, and he got embroiled in a scandal involving his mistress and the selling of military commissions. This was especially humiliating because he'd overseen the reorganization of the army and tried to establish a more professional structure based on recruiting based on meritocracy. Like James II, there are places named after him. In Canada, Duke of York Bay, and the towns of York and Albany again, but this time in Western Australia. It's amazing what being the son of a king who ruled the largest empire the world has ever known does for your legacy. There's also the not insignificant Duke of York column in London, located at the top of Duke of York steps on the north side of the Mall. They were completed in 1834. On top of the column is a bronze statue of Fred, 120 foot in the air. He died in debt, and it was joked he was placed on the column to avoid his creditors. The monument cost £21,000. Much of it was raised by soldiers who, apparently totally voluntarily, all decided to donate a day's pay to fund it. So which one of these Dukes of York and Albany was the real Grand Old Duke? Well, we can't really say. Don't turn off. But perhaps, like most nursery rhymes, there's an underlying message. British military tactics and planning was not always perfect. The notion of British failure was especially popular in the late 1790s in the newly independent United States, who took any opportunity to celebrate military disasters for Britain, and the incompetence of the royal family just sealed the deal. Meanwhile, professional soldiering came to the fore, like Arthur Wellesley, the commoner who became a duke, this time of Wellington, through his skills at Waterloo. The age of dukes who were sons of kings marching men up and down hills was over. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you might consider hitting the like button and perhaps subscribing to see more. Bye for now.